Llegó Fidel y se acabó la diversión. Llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Y se acabó la diversión. Llegó el comandante y mandó a parar.
What the role of Shahan you, the choreography Calgary or El Capitan Fidel Castro. Welcome to you all today to remember and commemorate with affection and respect Fidel Castro, affectionately known among his friends and comrades and his people as El Capitan. Fidel was born the 13th of August 1926. After devoting his life to the revolution and the overthrow of capitalism and his own people, he passed away on the 27th of November 2016. First of all, we're going to have Barry to give us a short introduction, followed by Tommy giving us his perspective on the revolutionary soldier Fidel Castro, the revolution and Che Guevara. Go on, Éalú. Barry.
Thanks, Frankie. Welcome you all here today. Thanks, Noel. For probably a timely talk and a bit of discussion about Fidel Castro's life and his achievements and what he spent his life trying to do on the Cuban Revolution, which continues to this day. It's probably something that, you know, it shouldn't take a death or something like this to get you to talk about what they're doing, but unfortunately that's normally the way of things. So Fidel Castro, probably the world's most famous socialist, and we're sitting beside probably Tyrone's most famous socialist here, so very happy, and we'll keep it short. But again, I think it is timely, and it is something that we should be getting into more of. We have more discussions about models of how we can work towards creating more equal society, creating opportunities, you know, to move the socialist project forward. And again, not to misquote someone else, you know, but it's a word that we need to become more comfortable talking about. At one stage there, people were nearly afraid to become the S word. People barely would have mentioned it, you know, and I think thankfully those days are starting to recede. But again, it's getting it back into the common vernacular, you know, where people start to talk about it, you know, openly and honestly, and saying what parts of it, where can we make gains, where can we make efforts to try and make it a reality rather than just a talking point. So Tommy would fit to talk about it a lot better than I am, so without further ado, I'll hand you over to Tommy. So.
Thanks, Barry. I'm not sure that I can speak any better, but I've been asked to speak anyway, and thanks for that introduction to Frank and to Barry. And it is a timely idea that we would talk about Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution and Cuba itself. And there are some very important similarities between Cuba and Ireland. Now, there is a mistake frequently made that we try to say that one's the mirror image of the other, exactly the same conditions here as there are in Cuba or the same conditions somewhere else. And that actually doesn't serve the analysis well, but there are at the same time, some very important similarities. And many of them hinge around the concept and the practice of what we could call imperialism. And imperialism isn't something that's either new or something that has passed away. We are still impacted day and daily by the impact and the practice of imperialism. Imperialism, however, takes different shapes and different formats over many, many centuries. But what it's coming down to is a group, a class, or a number of people using power and wealth to hold on to power and wealth. And 1,000 years ago, when wealth came from land and agriculture, we had things like the Norman conquest of Ireland, where the Normans came and seized the land. As time went by, wealth came from commerce as well as the land. Wealth then came from industry. But if we look at the history of the empires, as an empire declines, a superpower will come very often to replace what was there. And if you look at the end of the 1800s, the end of the 19th century, while the great empires of Europe, the British, the French and the Germans were in decline, particularly the British, as it turns out to be, were in decline, the US was starting to emerge as one of the powerful, and eventually through the 20th century, the most powerful superpower in the world. Now, power and wealth cannot be separated, and depending on how you look at it, it depends who will have the power and who will have the wealth. If you're looking around this room, we would say that that wealth should be distributed in such a way that ordinary people have the power and have the power to distribute the wealth. If you're talking about an absolute monarchy, then the monarch and a few of his friends will say that they have all the wealth that will give them absolute power. But in other circumstances, you're talking about certain classes of wealthy people who wish to control the wealth in order to control the power, and to do so will attempt, therefore, to control the world. And as we were looking at the end of the 1800s, and this is something that we'll have to look at when we're looking at Cuba. That in Cuba, the Spanish, until the very end of the 19th century, the Spanish controlled Cuba. The Spanish had controlled South or Latin America and parts of the Caribbean. They controlled Cuba. Cuba, when you think of the map of the world, when you think of the Caribbean, Cuba is a strategically important island which control of will possibly give those who control of the Caribbean, which in turn protects or defends that whole eastern coast of the United States, the crucial part of the Panama Canal and down into South America. Cuba was and remains a strategically important part of the greater US North American power bloc. It was controlled by the Spanish up to 1898, when war broke out between the United States and Spain for control of Cuba. And the United States, with their power and their wealth at the time, led very spectacularly at one time through the Cuban-US War by Teddy Roosevelt. The Spanish were defeated, and effectively the Cuban Republic was established, but it was established in such a way that the US emerging superpower of the United States was to have absolute control over Cuba. And under what they call the Platt Amendment of 1904, it states that the government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property and individual liberty, and for discharging the obligations with respect to Cuba imposed by the Treaty of Paris on the United States, now to be assumed and undertaken by the government of Cuba. In other words, Cuba, ostensibly independent, but was going to be under the guidance, control of the United States of America, because the United States of America, this emerging superpower, or the imperial power that was emerging, the new imperial power that was overtaking and was to overtake the British and the French and the German empires, that the European powers was going to overtake it through the 20th century, was setting out its position and positioning itself, among others. At the same time, they were taking over Honolulu, they were taking over the Philippines, they were passing acts of Congress to say that the United States of America controlled the Philippines, controlled Honolulu. Now, when you're talking about imperialism, this is nothing new. You know, the imperial powers will award themselves the right to dominate someone else. The Yankees were doing the same in Cuba. Now, immediately by 1906, when there was a dispute over the presidency of Cuba, the Yanks again sent back in their armies, took control of Cuba, and after a 3-year period of what they would call pacification, they appointed a president in Cuba who was completely amenable to US power. And that is the essence of the relationship that existed for the first 50, 60 years of the 20th century between the United States and Cuba. The United States saw Cuba as an asset. Now, yes, there was large sugar plantations in Cuba from which American companies gained wealth. There was also, in Havana, there was great gambling casinos over which the mafia, the US New York mafia, had exercised control. But these were, in many ways, although a tasty little pickings for wealthy Yankees, they were secondary to the greater global strategy of the US superpower. However, what was important in this was the fact that if you like, the popular culture in the United States deemed Cuba through the eyes of the gambling casinos, through the salsa dancing, through the brothels in Havana, to create this impression. Not that Cuba, one, was a strategically important military asset for the United States as a superpower, or even that it was financially viable for them, but to create the impression that Cuba was, if you like, it was a holiday resort for gamblers, for the mafia, for brothels, for sex workers, and that the Cuban people effectively were, if you like, childlike. Now start to think and start to compare this here. These nice people, likeable people, they loved to dance. They were a little bit, loose morally, danced the night away, sang, drank rum, and were not really able to rule themselves. That while they were very fine people, they were childlike, and it required the sensible, controlling hand of the wasps in New York. Now, compare that to what the British would have said through the 18th century, the 16th, 17th, the 18th century about us. Likeable enough people, but needed the firm hand of London to guide us, to govern us. We couldn't govern ourselves. Same thing was said about the Cubans, and this was this thing of promoting the slightly loosely moral Cubans, none of which is actually true, because the vast majority of Cubans through those years and since were working in sugar cane plantations, they were working as housemaids, they were doing a hard, long day's work, and very, very little had they got to do with the bright lights that the tourists from the United States come to enjoy. But it created a mentality that these were people, plus the fact that because they were childlike, they were also prone, and this is also important, as was said about the Irish, because they were childlike, simplistic people, they were prone to be misled by dangerous, sinister, radical revolutionaries. So even more so, it was necessary to control and exercise that control over them, for their own good, of course, for their own benefit. This was what was said, because otherwise they'd be misled and led astray by dangerous elements. And between 1933 and 34, Cuba was governed under the dictatorship of General Batista, very much in favour in Washington, but also because of the global politics at the time, the Second World War. Batista had, if you like, an unspoken agreement with the unions in Cuba that he would tolerate the unions, and the unions had a considerable number in their senior ranks of the Communist Party. So on the surface it would almost appear that Batista was tolerant of Communist Party members. It was a strategic thing because of the Red Army's involvement in the Second World War, its crucial involvement in the Second World War. But by 1952, the situation had changed entirely. The United States and Western Europe was engaged in the Cold War, rolling back the influence of the Soviet Union. And at that stage, whenever there was a slightly liberal president elected, Batista staged a coup in 1952. The first thing Fidel Castro, who at that stage was a young, qualified lawyer, Castro took an injunction to the High Court in Havana challenging the legitimacy of the Batista dictatorship. And as you can imagine, the judiciary is very rarely at odds with the executive, surprisingly enough. I mean, we have no surprise in this country, the judiciary rarely differs from what happens in the 10 Downing Street or in the Dáil. And the judiciary in Havana said, yes, of course, Batista is entitled to do what he has done, perfectly legal, and dismissed Fidel Castro. And it was at that stage that Castro and his supporters, and they were all very, very young men and women, decided that the only option now is revolution. And Cuba was under the hand of the Batista dictatorship, but in 1953, a year after that, Castro organised, and if you can think of Cuba, you know the map of Cuba, it's long and narrow, about 500 to 600 mile long. Castro came from the south, down in the San Diego de Cuba, that's the very bottom of Cuba. Cuba, if you like, San Diego de Cuba has been described, now we might here in this parish take some odds with this, but San Diego de Cuba has been described to me as, if you like, rebel Cork in Ireland. You know, it's the rebel heart of Cuba, as Cork is the rebel heart of Ireland. Now, as I say, we're in Tyrone, we're not necessarily going to buy into that. It's a prejudice. We're not going to buy into that piece of shit. But, so, look, on the 26th of July 1953, Castro and a group of armed supporters attacked one of the big military installations in San Diego called the Moncado Barracks. Now the Moncado, obviously, as you can imagine, contained a lot of Batista's troops, plus the fact that there was a lot of weaponry in it. That was the objective, to take the barracks, to eliminate the military capacity and to seize the weapons. That was the big one. However, they were foiled by the guards. They were defeated in their attempt. A lot of them were captured, brutally treated, and it's treatment that we even find hard to understand. At that time, Batista his people had a particularly nasty form of torture. It was like, if you know what a cobbler's awl is, you know, that very sharp, or a compass needle, take someone, tie their hands behind their back and poke their eyes out with a needle. That was only one of their horrendous situation. Castro managed to break out of the cordon, hid in the mountains for a few days. He was hid actually by a Cuban policeman who hid him in his home, and then when he could negotiate a peaceful or a safe surrender for Castro, brought him into the authorities. And Castro then was charged. It became a very famous trial, and Castro made a long speech for which over the years he was to become even more famous. He would talk for even longer than some of us here would talk. But Castro made a very famous speech, and at the end of his speech from the dock he said, you know, you may condemn me today, but history will justify my actions. History will absolve me. The story may absolve our own. And that become in many ways one of the, if you like, it was one of the great phrases. History will judge me kindly, will judge our revolution kindly. And I don't know whether he was conscious. I doubt if he was not aware of what he was saying, but if you think of what Barack Obama said when he was talking about Castro at the end, there says, history will judge Guevara, or Castro. And I suspect maybe history will maybe judge Castro more kindly than it will Barack Obama, but that's another story. Because of the political pressure that Batista was under, the popularity of the unpopularity of his own regime, he was forced to release those that had been captured in the aftermath of the Moncada. They went abroad, went to Mexico, where they reorganized, and it was there that Castro met Che Guevara. Che was an Argentinian revolutionary who had made his way up from Argentina through Latin America, came to Mexico, and at one stage, because they were both deemed to be undesirables, the Mexican police had arrested Che and arrested Castro, and they all were sort of, if you like, locked up in the cells down below the station, and that's where Che and Castro met. They decided they would return to Cuba, and they hired a small boat. This become again one of the, if you like, the iconic elements of the revolution. They hired a small boat called the Granma. The Granma was designed to hold ideally 12, maximum 25. 82 of them got onto the boat, and it came across the Caribbean Sea to Cuba, and it arrived in Cuba on the 2nd of December 1956. Like, just like that's 70 years ago, almost to the day. Now, as they landed, 82 of them landed, they were immediately attacked because they'd been tracked coming in. They were immediately attacked by Batista's troops as they come ashore. And as they come ashore, there was only 10 or 12 of them survived, broken up, dissipated, got it through to the mountains. Che, who was a medical doctor, himself was wounded, and he was forced through the next few days and weeks as they very slowly reassembled to tend to what wounded were there. Most of them were dead. But this began what was, in military guerrilla terms, become known as the FOCO. The theory of FOCO is the theory of the military reorganisation of the Cubans. And FOCO it means the focus. And the FOCO, rather than in different radical revolutionary movements where you say that you need a mass of the people, this isn't to contradict the understanding that revolution comes about through the interaction of the masses on the situation, that a mass of the people is required. But what they did militarily was saying they could establish a small group of guerrillas in the mountains and just survive. And they become a focus for the wider revolution. This is their theory of FOCO. The thing that you have to keep in mind when you're talking about FOCO is that they only survived, and they were only able to produce a revolution arising from FOCO because of widespread, broad support from the people. As they went into the mountains, they found help in the mountains. They were protected by the people of the mountains. They were fed and looked after by the people of the mountains. Now, they were down in the south, near to where they had started in San Diego. The Sierra Maestra, which is just to the north, literally to the north of San Diego. If you're in San Diego, the mountains up above you are the Sierra Maestra. That's where they were. And they contacted immediately their underground. Very famously in San Diego, their contact was a man called Frank Piez. Frank Piez was later, these were all very young people. Frank Piez was later to be captured by the Batista's troops and brutally done to death as well. But this network organised to bring food, to bring intelligence, to bring ammunition, to bring money where they could to the mountains. And by surviving in the mountains, they were a threat to the stability of the Batista regime. But bit by bit, using their ability to survive, they started to undermine Batista's authority. They started to extend their influence across the island as it moved towards Havana. And this led to a situation where by 1958, Batista had decided that it was imperative that he make an assault, an all-out assault on the what was then known as the 26th of July movement, named after the day of the attack on the Moncada in 1953, to the 26th of July movement, which was gaining support, was gaining numbers, was gaining manpower and ability, was subjected to a massive assault. But the assault was turned around after a number of months, when they turned them around in the end of July 1958 in a series of very significant battles where they overcome several battalions of Batista's troops. Now, they were using different tactics against the advancing Batista's troops. For the most part, they may have been officered by wealthy people, by the upper class, but by and large their troops were conscripts, poor conscripts, and they simply were not able to withstand the ferocious dedication of the revolutionaries, who employed guerrilla tactics to overcome them. But they turned that major offensive in July of 58, and then in August of 58 went over onto the offensive themselves. And the first thing they did on the offensive was to split their resources into 4 columns. One to stay broadly in the south under Fidel's command, and the other 3 columns led on by one of them, Camilo Cienfuegos was one of the columns, the other one was under Che, and the third one, I forgot who the third column was. But as they started to move on towards Havana, they went through the plains. The key battle in many ways was fought in a place then in December of that year. The key battle at the end was fought in December in a place called Santa Clara. Santa Clara, the last big city before Havana. And this was the, if you like, the greatest military triumph of Che Guevara. Che won the Battle of Santa Clara, and his remains are now in Santa Clara. But once Santa Clara fell, the South was also under the control of the revolution. Santa Clara was under the control of the revolution, and the way was open then to Havana. And at that stage, when the revolutionaries had captured Santa Clara, on the 30th of December, on the next day, the second next day, the 1st of January 1959, Batista fled Havana. And at that stage then, it was effectively victory for the revolution. And that's when Castro started that long march that we've heard about, the long march from San Diego up through Cuba to Havana. And I'm sure you've been watching the films of the remains of Castro being taken back to San Diego. This is a reverse of the long victory march from San Diego to Havana. If you remember, they stopped on their way through Santa Clara. Fidel's remains, his ashes, were kept overnight in the tomb beside Che, and therefore on down to San Diego. But this effectively was the victory of the revolution. The 26th of July movement had taken control in Cuba. Now, at that stage, the outcome of the Cuban Revolution was not absolutely assured of what was going to happen as far as the US was concerned. The US had, when they saw Batista collapsing, realizing that there was vast disdain for the Batista regime in the last months, if you like, a politically guided manoeuvre. They put an arms embargo on Batista in an attempt to woo the 26th of July movement, to bring it into their orbit of control. However, and this is something that we have to keep in mind, that whenever the 26th of July movement, Fidel Castro and his brother Raul, who was a very, very influential person, Raul is today the president, his younger brother Raul, and it has been argued from time to time that in terms of Fidel's ideological development, his socialism, that a lot of it came from his brother Raul, that Raul was the ideologue in the family, that Raul was the person who crystallized Fidel's thinking. Of course, some of these things can be exaggerated, as if someone of the enormous intellect of Fidel Castro had to be influenced by or instructed by someone else. I mean, it's clearly too simplistic to say, because these are capable and competent people. But if we go back at this stage to the picture the United States had created of Cuba, of this, if you like, holiday, sleazy area in the sun, in the Caribbean, rum drinking, salsa dancing, slightly loose morally in terms of sexual morality, a little bit loose, that these people, childlike, that they could influence the new revolution towards the United States, the Yankee way of life, and that was their objective at that stage. But because that picture of Cuba was misplaced, now certainly the mafia controlled the gambling casinos and the brothels. Certainly there was brothels, but no more than you would have found in any big city where there was poverty. There certainly was drug dealing, and certainly the mafia were there. But for the majority of Cuban people, their life was not dictated or dominated or controlled by that, nor for most of them was there any great awareness of what was happening. They hadn't the money to be visiting casinos or whatnot. For the vast majority of the Cuban population, it was crushing poverty, exploitation in the sugar plantations, in acting without proper labour rights, And that was what was happening, that the country was controlled not just as a strategic asset for the United States, but also it was running as a low-wage, cruelly treated economy, where many of the large corporations were US owned, with very, very little human rights or labour conditions. So when the revolution took over, while obviously they kicked out the mafia, while obviously they took a hard line against the sleazier elements in Havana, they also started to introduce a qualitatively different form of administration. And they recognised that there was mass illiteracy, there was an absence of health, there was an absence of provision in terms of housing, homes, and provision for the elderly. Many of the, what we would call, if you like to use a trade union term, the social wage. That wage that's beyond your pay packet on a Friday evening if you're lucky enough to have a job, but education, health, care for the elderly, building of roads, street lighting, all of the things that makes life tolerable, this had been removed. To do so, it's necessary, therefore, to tax. And at that stage, this is where then metal hit the bone with the Yanks, because they didn't see this as suitable. They then started to come a period of hostility between the United States and Cuba. And when the Cuban government under Castro and Che and Raul decided that they were going to break their connection with the free market, capitalist United States business and economy, then the war against Cuba began. And because the United States believed that it was entitled, as I've said, from the 1904 Platt Amendment, that they could exercise the right to intervene for at any time in Cuba for the protection of life, property and individual liberty. Individual liberty is interpreted by the United States. The governing class in the United States, individual liberty is interpreted as the liberty to make unlimited sums of money by any means necessary. And that's what individual liberty means in the United States. The new Secretary of the Treasury, a guy called Munchin, that Trump has appointed, is ex-director of Goldman Sachs. He then moved on to take over One Direct, it was called, bank, and he has been responsible for more evictions from homes than any other banker in the United States of America. That's what liberty means to the United States ruling elite. So when they go in to protect individual liberty in Cuba, what they're saying is the individual liberty to make vast sums of money by any means necessary from the population that is there. They then promoted an invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles, people that had left, those that had benefited under the old Batista regime, right-wing reactionaries who had fled to Miami. They promoted this attack, and the Yanks promoted this, supported by the CIA and promoted by the US Air Force. And their invasion was directed at a particular part of Cuba in order to play a gear on of the Bay of Pigs. Now, they were confident that with US support and US air cover and heavily armed emigre reactionaries, that they were going to return to Cuba and do what they had done so many times before, storm Havana and expel the revolution. But on this occasion, at the Bay of Pigs battle, the Cuban Revolution held firm and defeated the aggression. Overcame the Yankee invasion and the Yankee supported invasion, and at that stage then Castro decided that he had to protect Cuba by drawing in military support from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union provided missiles, which led to the crisis of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when again John Kennedy, the president, he deemed that nuclear missiles in Cuba was a threat to the American homeland, the United States homeland, and that he ordered the Soviet Navy to turn back. This led, for a few days, there was intense fear that a nuclear war was going to break out. It led to the doctrine. John Kennedy said that any attack by the Soviet Union would be deemed similar to an attack on the United States of America and would lead to immediate retaliation, nuclear retaliation on the Soviet Union. And that placing missiles that close to the United States was that the United States would not tolerate and could not tolerate the placing of missiles 100 kilometres off the United States border. Now, let me digress for a few minutes, or a few seconds just. Roll that forward to today, when you're thinking of nuclear warheads being placed along the eastern borders of Ukraine, the Baltic states, and down into Turkey, all pointing over the border. And you ask why Moscow is so sensitive, and are they entitled to be sensitive? Well, you'd say what's sauce for the goose may well be sauce for the gander. But the deal was done between Moscow and Washington that Moscow would withdraw its missiles from Cuba, but the Yankees were going to have to withdraw some of their missiles from Turkey and guarantee the ongoing non-military intervention in Cuba to prevent an escalation of the Cold War into a nuclear war. Now, different opinions survived about this. Moscow, in its wisdom, considered it not necessary to consult with Cuba or Fidel Castro before they done the deal with the United States, for which Fidel Castro was furious that he had been overlooked. Now, you can make up your own mind whether, the benefits of that, whether he was justified in being outraged or whether he got a decent deal, he survived, and the Soviets managed to de-escalate the danger anyway. But anyway, there are niceties that maybe were overlooked in the crisis. But what the Yankees then decided to do was, rather than escalate the military offensive, they put an economic blockade on Cuba, that absolutely no economic transaction would be done between America or any of America's allies or dependencies and Cuba. So you couldn't send a check, you couldn't send money, you couldn't visit Cuba, you couldn't have any transaction whatsoever with Cuba. And those countries that did, it was like nowadays you hear about what happens to countries that have been, or some of the banks that have been dealing under the counter with Iran, where there was an economic blockade of Iran. These companies, if they want to remain and retain an office in the United States, they will be fined huge amounts of money, billions of dollars, if they have been found to have broken the embargo on Iran or the embargo on Russia at the moment as it stands. The same thing with Cuba. So the only outlet Cuba had then, the only way it could sell its produce, the only way it could access oil, steel, and Cuba is an island of about 10 million people. It had been underinvested in terms of technology, so it didn't have a vast technological base. It needed all its electrical equipment, all its mechanical equipment, all its, if you like, heavy tools, it needed drills, whatnot. It had to get them somewhere. The only place it could get it was from the Soviet Union. So therefore the deal existed, that in order to have its oil, in order to have its vehicles, in order to have its electric bulbs, bit by bit the Cubans started to build up a technological industrial base. But keep in mind, with 10 million people, there's only so much you can produce, there's only so much you can concentrate on, there's only so much you can specialise in. You can't make that. This is just one of the facts of life, that with a small island nation, something we need to think about ourselves. How much can you specialise in? You can't dabble in every conceivable piece of technology. Cuba survived from 62 to 92 under those conditions. Their economy was pretty much similar in terms of its resources, of its material product, to that of the Soviet Union. It drove Soviet cars, they had Soviet kettles, they had whatnot, all of which was very good. You didn't have the range that you would have if you were wealthy enough to live in California, but you had enough to eat, you could get by, you could get around. This changed dramatically and drastically in 1992 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. A new regime under Yeltsin cut off overnight all access to the economy of the Soviet Union. Simultaneously, the Yankees maintained and upped their blockade of Cuba. So the Cubans were effectively left with a siege economy. And this led to two things happening. One, because Cuba, with its population, unlike Ireland where we produce a surplus of beef and milk, the Cubans, their geography and their climate and their land doesn't lend itself to that surplus production of beef. And where you produce beef, you're obviously going to have the ability to produce milk. You know, cows give us cattle, and so I mean, we know what I'm saying here. They didn't have that. They had anything about sugar. They could produce rum. There's only so much you can do with sugar and rum. But what actually happened, surprisingly enough, was that for another 10 years, the Cuban economy, under an enormous siege, a lot of things simply disappeared. For example, biro pens become almost impossible to get. They had to find some way to make biro pens. Safety pins, all of these things went. But strangely enough, this was a country that had concentrated after the revolution on education. Literacy was turned around. Illiteracy became almost unknown. Hunger became unknown. Homelessness became unknown. Child mortality at birth, the levels of child mortality at birth went to one of the lowest in the Western Hemisphere. But what also happened with the siege after 92 was that because of the difficulty of producing milk and beef, what they did was milk would become a rationed item for mothers and children, and very little of it would go to the rest of the adult population. There was very little meat, very little fat. The people become almost not vegan but vegetarian. And simultaneously, one of the unanticipated benefits of this was that cardiovascular ailments declined enormously. People found that their cholesterol levels were going down, their health actually improved in the absence of fat, beef and that. Now, after another 10 years, the Cuban economy again decided to make somewhat a change as we went into this millennium, where they started to open their doors to tourism. And while the United States held on to its embargo on the economy, Europe and other places started to visit Cuba, and the Cuban economy started to take in some foreign currency with which it could deal through tourism. Now, there are mixed views on how successful this has been, but with their backs to the wall, they managed to turn around a very precarious situation, all of which was to a large extent overseen by Fidel Castro. Now, again, what we're talking about here is undoubtedly Castro, faced with the situation he was in, supported by his comrades in the executive, they did undoubtedly have a one-party state. They had a one-system economy. Now, there is an old observation made that you can spend your life working for socialism, you achieve a socialist state, and then you just wait for the CIA to come in and overthrow you. And that's not an exaggeration. If you look what was happening, So the Cubans were saying, well, okay, are we going to open the door after what we've done, what we've suffered, what we've seen? Are we going to provide a platform for someone to come in here and undermine us, to create a counter-revolution, as they certainly will? And we've any amount of evidence that they're doing it. No. Have we to take a hard line against those that are plotting to overthrow the state? Well, of course. And you're sitting watching a large, well-funded, financed emigrant population just over a few miles over the Straits in Miami, sitting, waiting day in, day out to overthrow the work that has been done. So there are a few civil liberties that will be trampled on. You might have to keep an eye on the press, you might have to keep an eye on the dissidents. There are other areas of it, but on balance, the Fidel has inspired the revolution to turn around the economic and social conditions of the people of Cuba. As somebody said, the only Cuban children now sleeping rough are in Miami. You don't get Cuban children sleeping on park benches. You'll get Irish children sleeping in doorways in Dublin and Belfast. You'll even get them maybe even in Dungannon for all I know, but you'll certainly get them in Dublin, Belfast, Cork, Limerick. There are no children sleeping on park benches in Cuba. Literacy, child mortality, hunger, all of that has been turned around under the revolution. Not only that, but their health system is among the best in the world. They've turned out more doctors per capita than any other country in the world. They have sent their doctors around the world in a gesture of international solidarity. And in Southern Africa, at a crucial period of time, when apartheid was in the balance, when neo-imperialism was attempting to regain a foothold in Southern Africa, in Angola, the Cuban army went in on a gesture of international solidarity to support the revolutions in Southern Africa, which led in time, in turn, to the defeat in combat in Angola of the apartheid South African army, which was deemed invincible. The Cuban could be beaten, as they did beat them, and undermined confidence in South Africa, which played a large part in leading to the collapse of the apartheid regime. You can see the photographs of, on his release, Nelson Mandela going to visit Fidel Castro. Those are that's the situation. Its relevance to today, look, I don't think we need to exaggerate its relevance today. We can talk that over if we have any time left, if I haven't talked too long. But that's what they have achieved. That's where they are. For a small island nation that has turned around their situation themselves. And one of the great inspirations for that, of course, has been Fidel Castro. We don't subscribe to the great man of history theory, because history is made by the people and the masses, but on occasions needing inspiration, and Fidel Castro was one of those who provided immense inspiration for the revolution in Cuba. So, Gwynne Margaret.
Well, any questions? We'll have a Q&A session now, or anyone else has questions. There's a man in the front.
No, it wasn't a question. I just wanted to say that myself and 4 sisters and a brother-in-law went to Cuba in October 2014. And I'll cut it short because we might be have to leave early. But the things I noticed was the streets were immaculate. There was no drunks lying on the bank doors, and the people were not very well off. I've never seen anyone, not exaggerating, I've never seen a really fat Cuban, right? It was just something that Tommy said, you know.
What's this to this?
Yeah, so the point is, the man sweeping the streets had no machine. He had what, you know, like the old witch in Halloween, basically, you know, little broom thing. And all he had was a car, and the police would have mapped the streets. I've seen 2 policemen. I was brought up with the Christian Brothers. We were under the communist system. All the churches are closed, and the nuns are raped, and all the rest. All the churches were open. Not that I'm very religious, but The churches, some of the churches were interested. So I'll get to the main point. The main point was that before I left, there was a number of people wanting me to say something in Cuba, so I said, I'll meet anybody who wants to meet me. And I ended up anyway, a number of people involved, the Trinidad Embassy was involved, and the Dublin, Cuban people in Dublin. So anyway, the point, communications were difficult because most of them spoke Spanish. And when I got there, the only people that spoke English that I came across were people in the tourist trade. The one point about the tourist trade was, although there's money came in for the hotels, Castro demanded that all the staff would be local labour, you know. There's no Yanks working in hotels, it's all Cuban people, and most of them all speak English, and some of them speak other languages. So, cutting it short, I went up about 15 minutes early to the International Relations and Cooperation Department, and the man at the door had no English, spoke Spanish. I had no Spanish. And he was pointing down the street, two young women coming up. He's going, he said to me, England? I said, no, Ireland. And anyway, they ended up being the interpreter and the note taker. So we got in, and the main speaker, the main man in charge, I arrived a bit late, maybe like an Irish Republican, but anyway, the other man in charge took it very, showed us all the stained glass, you know, and pointed out some of the statues, Allende, and you know, the main square. And so the main man came in, and again, no English. Everything was done through an interpreter, two young women, and the other one took notes. And he spoke about how Ireland had inspired the revolution, the great respect for the Irish struggle, and inspired the world, 1916 and that. And he seemed to well up in Irish affairs. And then I spoke on the civil rights and how it started and the discrimination. We all know that, we don't think I have to go into that. And during the talk I had said that I had known 3 of the hunger strikers, 2 better than the other one, and that I had really admired Fidel Castro, one of the very few leaders in the world who came out and spoke on behalf of the hunger strikers, and that I would like to say thank you. I cannot speak for the families, but the families I know would appreciate the thanks being passed on. And then he interrupted, he said, we have a monument here in Cuba, in the park, to the hunger strikers. We have one for John Lennon Park. And so now and again the conversation went on. Before that we had coffee and no drink. It was no Guinness. It was like pig skin rolled up. It was delicious, like wee balls and that. So the thing was that the mayor of Derry had heard I was going, and she decided to send a letter on the plaque of the Derry coat of arms, the old county coat of arms, which is a skeleton, I'm sure you all know. The joke of Derry is a Catholic being proud. Still
the same.
Still the same. So anyway, the point is that, so I usually have a bug of this. If I'm going to present the plaque of the city of Derry, and the mayor happened to be the niece of John Hume, I'm going to make my own presentation. So I brought along a commemorative DVD of the 1968 Civil Rights Movement, and I left one and should get myself. This was I presented with my book, Ireland, England, Vietnam, 1960s, 1990s, and the thing was, the conversation, the whole thing went on for about an hour and a half. There wasn't a great lot of people. It was more or less leading likes. His surname was the same as Castro. I never found out R-U-I-Z. I never found out actually where they were related, but he was in charge of the International Relations Department. The strange thing was that the guide that we had, he tells me later on in the visit that he's a Catholic, he's also a member of the Communist Party. Like these kind of contradictions, you know, the Christian Brothers might even have thought, oh, that's rubbish. But so there will be a lot of practicing Catholics who still members of the Communist Party, very proud members of the Communist Party. Then I wanted to go to Che Guevara's grave, and our family wanted to put a wreath, and again, the old veterans of the revolution, they had no English either, and I was saying I want to put a wreath in the grave and sign language and all that. Oh, no. And he's going, Guevara, not like that, Guevara, right? So what it meant was, that what I worked out was that Guevara was buried in the wall. His remains were in the wall, and his head was in marble, and the rest were in bronze, all at the end of Heroes of the Revolution. You go into the museum, it goes on the armed guard, and they salute you as you come in and that. And the museum is more or less his guns, his letter to his family, his letter to Castro telling him he's going to Bolivia to continue the revolution. Like Trotsky wanted to export the revolution in Russia. Stalin believed in socialism in one country. And each stethoscope and things like that. And then you would then do the attached to the museum was where he was buried. And then you were given a red carnation, and there's a little reed thing you could put a flower into. But it was an interesting experience, and we wanted to go when Castro was living, and maybe if God spares us, if there's a God, maybe fate might step in, but that we'd likely go maybe 10 years down the line. But the interesting thing was that the top man of the International Relations Department, he says that the meeting was confidential. And I could speak about it after certain events would take place, and I would know when they would take place, and who was to report back in Dublin and all about the trip. And he said, look, he explained all the things that Tom went on about. He says, we were considered the whorehouse of the Caribbean. We will not have a McDonald's in here. There will be no reversal of the revolution. We won't have in the big multinational stores, etc., etc., etc. We're going to protect our socialism, right? The Vatican, he says, has helped improve relations between Cuba and the United States, which was linked to the visit of the Pope. I lose track of which spoke what, but now there's two in store. There was the one before the last one that's resigned or stepped down. So the Vatican apparently done relations between both countries, and being a very Catholic country, still very Catholic in many ways, they believe that visit was more or less opened the door. And there's no way that they would reverse the policies of the revolutionaries. And the point is that I'm glad to hear Castro's brother more or less repeat the same thing only a couple of days ago. But on the trip all over Cuba, point is I found there was always very simple people. There's in many ways, I'm not insulted by saying that. They weren't rich, but they weren't poor, and they talked about their main export was not cigars or rum. Their main export was the doctors that you referred to. But those doctors went out gathering in other places, and they were then involved in the, what do you call that, disease? Ebola. And the point was that the revenue from their doctors going overseas, and their nurses, not being sexist here, but the point is that the revenue came in was a great help. They thanked Venezuela, they thanked the Chinese supplied the buses. Venezuela was helping build a new big port. And there was only a few countries in the world that actually helped them. And basically, I said I would keep it short, but it was a very impressive visit, and I would like to go back again. It's a beautiful country, lovely beaches. Their music.
Y en eso llegó Fidel, y se acabó la diversión. Llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. y se acabó la diversión. Llegó el comandante y mandó a parar.